We continue our look at Frederic Church. Again, just a quick reminder, Frederic Church is from the Hudson River Valley School of Art. This is kind of the first big school of art that's considered an American school of art, and he's kind of from the second generation. His primary teacher was from the first generation, Thomas Cole, who is really thought to be the beginning of the school, if you will. Frederic is known for traveling quite a bit to many and diverse locations. We saw in his previous lecture a trip he made down to South America. And with this lecture, we're going to look at some of the work he did when he traveled actually to the Arctic. This is actually one of my favorite paintings. Very, very simplistic, especially for the time period, but he travels to the North Atlantic up around Greenland to be exposed to this whole other aspect of life, and this is almost the other side of the coin, if you will, to the time he spent in South America in Ecuador. And again, it's fascinating to me. Here's another one of these wonderful landscapes that we see that's almost on the edge of being abstract. Aurora Borealis, we'll see another version of this painting a little bit farther along. But as I was saying, if you really think of the range of landscape that he actually exposes himself to, it's amazing. And again, this is something that's kind of common with early American artists. We do see them traveling quite a bit and looking at a diverse amount of locations. This is much more along the lines of the famous work that he did in conjunction with that trip to the Arctic area, where he did do a lot of sketching of these larger icebergs and translating them back into paintings. And again, most of these paintings are going to be very, very large in terms of scale. So when we look at the people on there, it's even more to the sense of the sublime. Here we can see a nightmarish prospect being stuck within an iceberg within the Arctic. We see the second and more famous version of the Aurora Borealis paintings, and if we look down towards the bottom left corner, we see this tiny, tiny little ship, and we can even move a little bit farther to the right, and you can see a tiny, tiny little sled with tiny little sled dogs moving along. And again, thinking of this, putting yourself in the place, which is the whole idea of this tiny little sled driver in comparison to this majesty around you. This is the wonderful thing about the landscapes of these time. We have one more little iceberg painting from 1891. And we put this in comparison to a painting we have from 1860 showing the very famous meteor of 1860 that was thought by many as a premonition of things to come, and a reminder that Frederic Church is an American painter. So a lot of the subject matter that we're going to see from him is going to be affected by what's occurring in America. Twilight in the Wilderness, 1860, a year before we have the beginning of the Civil War. We look at Twilight in the Wilderness, and to me this is always one of the more Thomas Cole type of paintings that we have from Church. But again, when we look at this, we do see a separation from the ideas, with Church having more of an idea of nature, while Thomas Cole kind of pursues more of a religious or spiritual aim through his work. Moving on to 1861 and Our Banner in the Sky. Again, this is the beginning of the Civil War, and we see this is always kind of a strange painting to look at. It's almost a little kitschy by our modern standards, but we need to remember this is before surrealism, and this is before a lot of the concepts of the abstract mind. So for him, I imagine this was kind of a leap, and again, it's very interesting to me to see this tree branch that's forming kind of the basis of what we think of as the flag. Moving forward to 1865, what actually happens is the Church family loses their two children in quick succession to each other. So Frederic actually leaves the country for a while. He goes to Jamaica and spends roughly about 6 months there. This is another wonderful little study, as we can see, kind of abstract in his use of the texturing in the left corner to symbolize the land. But from there, in 1867, we actually have the family going to Europe, and this is kind of odd to think that he had gone to all of these different places, and then at kind of the end of his travels is when he decides to go to Europe. His family goes to Europe, and they actually go to different parts of the Middle East as well. And a lot of these trips he kind of takes as solo expeditions, but we do see him referencing in back to ancient Greece and viewing the Parthenon and doing work. Jerusalem, it was more of the location that him and his wife were going to, and they did have a new son with him, along with, I believe, a mother-in-law as well on this journey. But the Holy Land was kind of their designation. If you think about the culmination of events that was occurring before in his life, it makes sense that this would be somewhere he would travel to. And again, when we look at this, it's so interesting to see how well he's able to translate all of these different landscapes over. And again, this massive catalog that he probably had in terms of landscapes as we view all of these different areas that he actually goes to. And again, another one of these wonderful, almost kind of abstracty, impressionistic type of paintings that we see from Church, almost a study, while on the other side of the coin we have those very, very fine, detailed landscape paintings that we know so well from him. As we see his career continue, we see him using a lot of these pieces, kind of putting together from his past. We have Ecuadorian landscape. We can see this is very much a scene from this part of the world, but it does look a little European as well, especially if we notice that bridge there in the background. And as we go off to the mountain, we can assume that's Cotopaxi again. But it does have kind of this almost tinge of being iceberg-like as much as a mountainscape. Rainy Season in the Tropics from 1866 is a little bit of out of place in terms of our chronology. This is one I kind of found towards the end of looking through his work, but it's an amazing concept. Again, this huge double rainbow that he has stretching across the canvas itself, and then Cotopaxi one more time off there in the distance. And if we look very, very closely at the bottom, going over to the right, we'll see tiny figures, most notably someone in a red coat. But when we compare that again with a later painting that we have from 1873, we can really see that he's kind of assimilated a lot of different ideas in terms of the landscape. This, we have an atmospheric perspective in the background at the mountain that we can assume is, one more time, Cotopaxi. But again, this translation of him looking at how the landscape actually looks in different parts of the world and really assimilating them together. We put that in almost direct comparison with something like this, the Aegean Sea, and we can see one more time that double rainbow that we just had from two images before. As we look over on the left side, what you'll see is actually just a little fragment of the ruins of Petra, and we know that Church actually took a trip down to Petra and actually has a very famous painting from that location that's very recognizable as well. Towards the end of his career, we see him adopting a little bit more of these larger landscape ideas like the River of Light, where we can kind of assume certain questions of mortality and such coming from this. And again, this isn't really placed in one individual landscape. This is kind of a culmination of what we see from his work down in Ecuador along, but again, an idealized landscape space rather than pushing it in one particular point. But he does kind of continue using these metaphors and using the drawings and sketches that we have seen before throughout his towards the end of his career. We do know that as he continues in his career, he does develop rheumatoid arthritis, as is very common with many artists. So he kind of slows down the work towards the end of his career. And as I mentioned earlier, it really is kind of remarkable that towards the end of his life, he does kind of fall more and more into obscurity rather than being renowned as this great American painter. But when we look at kind of some of these last images that we have painted by him, we do kind of find a certain amount of simplicity to them. And again, this might be a reflection of the fact that he does have arthritis, but it could just be the subject matter that he's approaching as well. The final painting we have is called Moonrise, and we have some wonderful Corinthian columns there to view, but this could almost be called Sunset in my mind as well. Again, an imaginary landscape where we can see pieces definitely from his trip to Greece, but we'll notice that these are ruins. And again, I always think that the psychology of the artist especially when we've used landscapes as kind of the point that you can kind of see the life and the feelings of the artist